So let's get into it. What do I mean by a trigger volume or a trigger zone? This is usually an area which you set up in a scene so that when a collider enters that trigger volume, it will set off an event such as trigger enter, on trigger exit, or on trigger stay. And from these events happening by the colliders colliding, we can enact certain other things to happen. We can create another event based off that event happening. So let's just create a trigger volume to show what I mean. Let's just create a cube. Okay, I'm going to create a material for that. I'm going to make it transparent. Make it red. Okay. So I've created the object, and then we have a box here to toggle on the box collider. Is trigger. True. So that's it. That's a trigger volume. So what would this be used for? Okay, so just imagine a typical scenario in a game where you walk up to a loot box, treasure chest or something like that. So imagine this kind of scenario. Walking along and you see a loot chest. Wow, goodies. So your character walks up to the loot chest, and as you get close to it, you get a message on the screen saying press E. And then when you press that, then the lid will open and all the goodies will fall out. So that's where a trigger volume is exactly used. When you come close to an item, you can initiate an event, such as telling the user to press a button, or checking if you are within a trigger zone and the button has been pressed, to run an animation, or to give out some goodies, anything like that. That's a trigger volume. So how can we start working with trigger volumes and getting these events to happen for ourselves? Okay, I'm going to create a new folder down here, make some scripts. And the first script is going to be a trigger volume script, just to show off these trigger events and how they get activated. So I'll create a new scene, so I can start all over again. Okay, first I'm going to set my scene up. Create a cube for the floor, as I do so many times before. I'm going to position it. I'm going to give it a floor type scale. So there's our floor. Now I better give it material so it looks like a floor. Let's create a floor material. And I have imported a couple of textures that I'll be using here. See how that scaling goes. Okay, not too bad. Of course that's far away. When we're close up, it's going to look fine. Okay, let's create a directional light to light up our scene. Get that way up in the sky out of the way. Okay, so what else do we need to start with? So we start walking around. Well, we need a character controller. So let's import that. I have imported the third person as well, so I've shown this fix many times. Don't even need to explain what I'm doing here. Just fixing that warning. Okay, so let's bring that first person character controller into the scene. Start off back here somewhere like that. And of course we now have two main cameras in our scene. We want to use one off the first person controller. Let's see if that's happening. Okay, as you saw there, the collider is absolutely penetrating the floor there. Just raise it up a bit. Okay, and we're off. There's our rough scene ready to go. So now let's create a trigger volume that we can walk into and make things happen. I'll create a cube. I'm going to name it our trigger volume. Set the box collider to is trigger is true. And I'm going to give it that material, because I like to use this transparent material just so I can see in my scenes where the trigger volume is. Now of course when you're playing a game like Borderlands or something like that, you don't see the trigger volume, so at some point in time we're going to have to disable that renderer. Okay, so you can't see it in the game, but it's absolutely there. But leave the renderer on, because you can see when you're editing, it's so much easier to manage. Let's give it a decent kind of size. Okay, so I'm going to leave the renderer enabled just while we're mucking around here at the start, just so that you can see where and when things should be happening. As you see there, the first person controller has entered the trigger volume there. Now we want to know about it, so let's start working on that script. Before I forget, I will attach the trigger volume script to the trigger volume. And because I've made all these changes, I'm going to save the scene. So let's look at this script. So what do we need to put in here so that we know that we've entered or exited a trigger? Well, let's check that in the Unity scripting reference. Even if I type in trigger, collider, on trigger enter, on trigger exit, and on trigger stay. So of course, open those up for yourself. And then you can read the definitions of what this command is doing. It's actually a function in this case. On trigger enter is called when the collider, another collider, enters the trigger. Okay, that looks good. That's where we want to start. So let's create that function for ourselves. So it was function on trigger enter. And what parameters are we looking for in here? So we're looking for an other. So what was entered into the trigger? And what is the type of that? Okay, we're looking for a collider. Other collider. Now let's just start off with a debug. This trigger was entered and spell entered by. Now what did we enter it with? So we have a reference to the collider of what set off this trigger event. So it's the other, and this is a collider. So from the collider we want to get the game object. And from that, let's just debug its name. Alright, save that out. Unity compile. Now currently I've just left the first person controller named first person controller. So we'll check the console, see what happens. So luckily we can see our trigger volume, because there's no goodies in there at the moment to run towards. There we go. As you can see, the first person controller has entered that trigger collider, and then we've gotten that message. And note, even while he's inside, we've only gotten that message once. It was only on the exact instance of that event happening. So if I leave, see nothing happens, walk into it again, there we have that message again. So it was entered, but it's only come up once, even though we're still standing inside it. Now what if I jumped? So I'm above it. Okay, so I've come back in. So we're getting another message. That will only happen on the immediate instance of that trigger being entered by another collider. So let's look at some of these other ones. There's entering. Okay, so we're obviously going to get an event for when we exit a trigger collider. It's pretty much exactly the same thing we're going to be starting out with. This time, on trigger, exit. Let's just update our debug. Trigger exit by other. Save that out. Let's see if we're going to get that reflected in our console here. Okay, so as I walk into the trigger zone, we have the message to say that we have entered. Now if I continue walking, there we go. So it's pretty much the same as the entered, but when we leave it, and it's only at the exact instance that that collider leaves this trigger collider. Okay, that's the floor, that's not helping. See that trigger collider on the box collider. As this collider leaves that, we get the exit. So the last one I mentioned was on trigger stay. We say it's called almost all the frames for every collider that is touching the trigger. On trigger stay. Let's see if we can add that in and see what's happening. I'm going to put it in the middle because logically that's where it would happen. You would enter, you would be in the collider, and then you would exit it. So let's just put stay. Let's just change that debug slightly again so we can see different things being printed out in the console. Now let's see what on trigger stay is going to do. So we have all the other things happening. We're going to get that enter first. Okay, but you see there's a lot of stay there. Now, like it said in the scripting reference, you're not going to get this every frame, but pretty much every frame. See? There it goes. If I clear it. Okay, see, we're definitely still in that collider. Now just watch the bottom as I leave, exit, enter. That was too fast. So where did I jump? So yeah, we get enough debugs for stay for things to happen anyway. So there we were standing in the collider. Exit is where I jumped, and as we came back in, the collider was entered, and then we had the stay debug resuming. That's about it. There's the basics of a trigger volume, how to use on trigger enter, on trigger exit, and on trigger stay to determine what colliders are involved with that trigger volume. So I just commented out the stay, so we can see the entering and the exiting one more time. Stay is still absolutely happening. We just don't have a debug to show us that it's happening. If I jump in from the top, there we go. We still entered it from the top. So there it is. Trigger volumes 1.